Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, Google Play, and a whole bunch of other venues. Just visit our sites, chimeraobscura.com/VM or vmspod.com to find more information, along with our RSS feed. And follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod. Well, not much to tell you about. I'm grinding out days, just waiting on next week's second dose of COVID vaccine and contemplating some in-person podcasts for spring and summer, which requires a lot of mental reframing. Again, not a lot. I ran more miles last week than I've done in quite a while. I'm trying to balance injury prevention with inertia. I drew more trees, which I'm still enjoying. Don't know where all that's going to go, but I'm getting better at it. I caught up with a few pals on the phone in the past week, which was nice, one of which led to an episode, but nothing that was podcast driven. They are people I've met through the podcast, and it's sort of gotten me thinking, and this is probably something I've ruminated about before, but how few people I've gotten to know in the last, I'll say 7 or 8 years come from anything other than the podcast or work. It's just a little weird, is all I'm saying, to be able to trace pretty much everyone I know in recent years back to like a single source, this show, or to gauge virtually anyone I meet as a potential guest of the show. But that's the life I've sort of carved out or fallen into. I'm not knocking it. The social life, such as it is. Okay, I hate to use the term social network, but the circle of friends, we'll put it that way, that I've developed through the show is intensely rich and meaningful. I've gotten to meet so many great people, stay in touch with so many of them, that it sort of substitutes for actually going out and seeing people, I guess. Anyway, these are my 5 a.m. thoughts. Take them or leave them. Let's get to this week's show. My guest this time around is Nate Powell, who has a new book out called Save It for Later: Promises, Parenthood, and the Urgency of Protest. It's published by Abrams Comic Arts. Save It for Later is a collection of 7 graphic essays about the last 5 years, and the desperation and fear that have nuked our psyches, and the challenges that Nate faces rearing young children during that era. I'd say Nate and his wife, Rachel. But the chapters are divided between personal essays and subject-driven ones, but they unify around the theme of just how fractured America has become and what we as citizens can try to do about it. Now, Nate is best known for his work telling the story of Representative John Lewis and the Civil Rights Movement in a graphic trilogy called March, for which he won the National Book Award in 2016. And as part of that project, he got to spend a lot of time with the congressman and sort of see firsthand what good trouble means. And I have a anecdote by association about that comes up during the episode. But the way that Nate's work is, tied to John Lewis and the example that he set over the years sort of makes this book feel like an extension of March in a sense, and of the lessons that the congressman's life has for us when it comes to making America a better place. So when I say Save It for Later captures fear and desperation, I should note that the book is also suffused with hope, and that the protest that is captured in the subtitle of the book and comes up in a number of chapters is part of what we have to do at times. And Nate shows us how his older daughter almost instinctively leans into the need for protest, and he compares that with his own childhood and its mixed messages about American history, especially Southern history, growing up in the South as Nate did. Save It for Later It's an important book. The artwork is great. We talk about it during the conversation, how his cartooning has grown over the years and the influence or what he had to learn in the process of making March that now works its way through other, more personal projects of his. Anyway, I hope you read Save It for Later. I hope it finds a wide audience. So here's Nate's bio for the book. Nate Powell is a National Book Award-winning cartoonist whose work includes civil rights icon John Lewis's historic March trilogy, Come Again, Two Dead, Any Empire, Swallow Me Whole, and The Silence of Our Friends. He has also received the Robert F. Kennedy Book Award, 3 Eisner Awards, the Michael L. Prince Award, the Comic-Con International Inkpot Award, 2 Ignatz Awards, and the Walter Dean Myers Award. He has discussed his work at the United Nations, on MSNBC's The Rachel Maddow Show, on PBS, CNN, and Free Speech TV. Nate lives in Bloomington, Indiana. His new book is Save It for Later. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Nate Powell. Where did it originate for you, but also how did it evolve over the course of the 4 years that you were documenting and living through simultaneously?
Well, I'd say most of 2016 and 2017, I was working on Come Again and finishing up the March trilogy at that time. But like 2017 was really my incubator year for what became Save It for Later. Really just spending most of my time doing dad stuff and, basically just trying to stay sane and mentally prepared for this sort of like high speed death march towards authoritarianism, but also observing shifts that were happening in my community, aesthetic shifts and noticing what people weren't talking about, noticing what I was sort of falling in line with. So by March 2018, I realized that as much as I think I'm best known for doing nonfiction comics, I'm not really a nonfiction comics kind of person.
Oh, yeah. I've got a question about that later on.
So this is one of these moments where I was like, this is one of the values of comics for me as a cartoonist is I have a lot of observations, but also just like worries. I need to put these on the page to kind of sort them out. And so all of the memoir chapters from Save It for Later were originally just their own separate book. I got this idea for a quick, raw, slim 96-page book that would be entirely memoir-based. And my goal was really to just kind of treat it like one of my older comics or like a personal fanzine and really just try to get them on the page and finish a book in 6 months and get it out there. So that it was kind of a boots on the ground expression of a lot of the worries and anxieties and some of the hope that we all shared. So simultaneously, I had started work on what became About Face, which was a mildly viral, comics essay about the symbols and aesthetics of going from like military to paramilitary to law enforcement contexts that had then become just kind of apolitical pop culture symbols and, easily purchasable ways to normalize this growing fascist presence in our society. And by the time I finished About Face, I realized that doing some of this more objective essay-centered comics work was not actually different from the more subjective memoir stuff I was doing. In fact, the two sides of the coin were enriching each other. So by November of 2018, when I finished About Face, I realized that About Face was the same book ultimately as the memoir stuff, and that's when things really took off, and I realized that there was value in bouncing back and forth between these two modes of delivery.
Yeah, were there challenges in terms of structuring or organizing it? I mean, on one level, there's just the chronological thing. Like we've all got pandemic life and the before time. Like there's a Stanley Tucci documentary, food travel series on CNN right now, and they have to give a disclaimer about which ones were filmed before and which ones are during, so you don't freak out over seeing all these people unmasked.
Of course.
But in terms of structuring and organizing, both chronologically, thematically, and everything else, what went into some of the the meta decisions?
Originally, I was just going to play it through chronologically. Basically, all of the memoir chapters before the pandemic hit remained in chronological order, but by having the freedom and the new set of options to intentionally place About Face in the best possible spot in the book to open up so much more of the book and its potential, that complicated things in a good way. I think originally I decided to make About Face the second or third chapter and sort of use that as a wedge in the door to all these other issues. And more or less my editor and I worked it out. She had a different idea for how the flow could work, and she was right about that. So we reshuffled things, and I was saving a set of pages for the final chapter of the book, which would encompass 2020. The rest of the book was finished in late January 2020. So, right,
and nothing could happen from now on. Yeah,
that's right. And so there was a quiet couple of months, and I wasn't thinking about it at all. But yeah, between May and August, I did Tornado Children, which became the 2020 chapter. And I recognized that structurally, it still couldn't be the final chapter in the book. It wasn't going to work with what my intention was for making the book in the first place. And that's where I decided, like, if I just date the completion of each of the chapters individually, then I have the freedom to continue shuffling them so that they're doing their best work in the book. So that's why there's a little bit of an anachronism with the insertion of the 2020 chapter, not at the end of the book.
Mm-hmm. Does the book help you recognize who you were over the course of those 4 years? Are there aspects of it you look back at and like, yeah, I'm a different person than the guy who did buttered noodles,
I think it just sort of allows who I know I am to stand in a very stark portrait for myself. A lot of that, I mean in a self-critical way. I think that particularly in parenthood, I don't respond very well to stress. And so it requires a lot of constant care and attention to like remember what I can do that allows me to keep my feet on the ground and be a better dad and a better partner. But there is a huge therapeutic benefit to putting those parts of myself, the stressed out, inattentive, judgmental, dismissive, panicky parts of myself on the page, by simply, sometimes it takes that to make you recognize that, you don't have wiggle room left to deny that these are personal problems or they impact other people, whether it's your family or whether it's your community or whether it's strangers whose lives and struggles you don't know. So I think that, yes, putting as many of my flaws as possible within the narrative has definitely been very therapeutic. But also, like, because this is told from my viewpoint, but that's sort of inseparable in ways from my kids and from my wife. But, trying to be respectful of their consent or for my kids, their inability to consent, with a lot of stuff, like a lot of viewpoints and attitudes and a lot of feelings my wife and I have shared over these past 4 and 5 years. When it finds its way in the pages of the book, whenever possible, I choose to make myself the idiot or the reactionary or the person who's blind. And generally that's true. I mean, My wife Rachel is just a stellar human being and somebody who really helps keep me grounded and make sense out of life. So that's not untrue, but I tried to push it as far as possible to make some of the medicine go down and to highlight how, there are hypocrisies and contradictions in my character and in a lot of other components in the book throughout. I feel like that helps carve out some of the space to accept that without being like, oh, Nate, the character is being a total hypocrite here. Or like, that's one of the joys of doing comics is getting able to present yourself in a truthful way, but also as a character.
Yeah. And you don't have to make yourself Buddy Bradley or anything like that. So,
right.
As if any of us could, but the word you mentioned earlier, this is me and my free associations. Last week I recorded with Michael DeForge. You mentioned community, and that was a key topic for us, both in terms of comics, the city in which he lived or lives, and the ways we interact with the world. Can you talk a little about community overall for you and what it means in terms of what did you learn during this administration? What did the past year of pandemia teach you about the world in which you live, the community that you have?
Well, yeah, I think on the entry level, I think my sense of community and my ideals come from punk a lot, and particularly being somebody who comes from the generation of punk that came of age in the 90s, we grew together very much steeped in the language and the ideals of community building and of making punk more than music and not only engaging with our towns, our communities, but building our own, micro community that can hopefully sustain itself. In parenthood, this is where, the less involved I became actively with punk as parenthood approached, I became more comfortable with my own personal contradiction that I'm also a comic book nerd and I'm a very outgoing introvert. And,
join the club.
Yeah, I love I love being around people in comics land or at punk shows or whatever, but I am always infinitely more comfortable hanging out with one person or just being by myself in my house doing my own thing. And I've learned that it increasingly takes more and more twisting my own arm to get me to follow through with what I know is the right thing to do when it has to do with social effort. But I'd say through parenthood, it's not wrong that parents generally you have this new set of challenges and you really lose a lot of bandwidth to become involved with a lot of other work. And that's okay. And before I was a parent, it was easy for me to be dismissive of how, when people become parents, they check out and they get a little lame. That's true. That's also okay. It involves trusting people to pick up the slack for each other, even if you don't know them and they don't know you. But I'd say during the last 4 years or 5 years, I'd say, you're also fighting very swift, subtle normalization of a lot of authoritarian thinking, not just, writ large in society, but you can see how quickly it embeds itself in you. Not only becoming, being really concerned, anxious, angry, afraid, and being motivated to get involved in some way, but also becoming paranoid as a result, and then doubting yourself, and then thinking you're overreacting. One of the main reason I started doing Save It for Later was by the end of 2017, so much was happening so quickly in 2017, intentionally, as Steve Bannon said, to flood the zone with shit so that we couldn't put out all these forest fires at once. There was so much happening that required real effort that I noticed that for most people, myself included especially, I sensed that there was this kind of assumption that there's just not enough bandwidth to speak publicly or spend a lot of energy on yes, I'm afraid, I'm anxious, I have doubts about this, what about this, that are less concrete and have less immediately tangible political consequences. Basically, I felt like the personal thread of like what was happening to us, the personal implications were already getting kind of swept under the rug, mostly because I could sense myself doing it. I'm like, oh, I don't want to bother anybody with that. We've got too much going on. Yeah. And then, I realized like that is the normalization of authoritarianism right there. Like that's how it plants its own seeds in your own mind, and recognizing how it had already claimed a small victory over me. I was like, well, at least I know there's something I can do. I can get this back out on the page, and hopefully encourage other people, like carve out a safe space so that people know that it's just okay to bring this stuff up. But specifically, it's important to bring it up now rather than later, because we're not actually going to be able to prevent this from happening successfully again, unless we're able to air a lot of this stuff and work our way through it collectively. In terms of how my interaction with, a community of neighbors and strangers has shifted, a lot of it is like accepting that it's not a defeat, that I don't feel like I'm an activist, and that's not defeat. I'm somebody who shows up, and most people are people who show up. And so I think there's been a lot of really good progress in terms of people having the words in a larger, social sense, having the vocabulary to discuss following the leadership of people who are taking risks and organizing movements, and not trying to make something about you, not trying to inject yourself into something that that someone else is handling well, finding other ways to actively support someone else's hard work, including, but never limited to, just showing up if possible. So I'm a lot more comfortable with the fact that, I make efforts on other fronts in life, but the least I can do in that larger social protest sense is show up whenever possible.
Yeah. I mean, you get into that in the early on in the book with that split between activism and retweeting. It's one thing to just click on something. It's another thing to show up. The story I tell, the week after the inauguration in 2017, I was driving back from a podcast down in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. And that was when it was a weekend, and it was the Muslim travel ban that had been instituted. And I'm approaching Philly International Airport on 95, where I used to drive an airport shuttle back in another life. But I saw it. I saw the protesters. I'm like, I can't not do this. I have, my Jewish mother wouldn't let me not do this. I have to pull in here and join the protest and, do what I can to be part of it. So yeah, it's, at the same time, there was are they going to have the face recognition thing going on? Cause I've got a job that interacts with the government. So yeah, there were, there were concerns. One of the things I thought was interesting, and save it for later, is that you and I did pretty much the same thing of never actually mentioning Trump by name. I did that for 4 years because part of my job as a lobbyist, I didn't want to come out too heavy about stuff that we were all thinking. I let the guests do that instead. And for you, it was a choice also in the book to barely even to render him. I think it's one or two images distorted, at a sharp angle looking at a TV that he's on. But
for me, a lot of that was, this is where I'm really, I don't know how a lot of these smaller details and inclusions are going to go over starting next week when the book is everywhere for people to read. For me, it was very important that I remember that for the last, 5.5 years now, the man's name and face invaded every part of our consciousness.
Every morning when you woke up, you had to see the tweets.
Everyone remembers the first time you had a dream where the man appeared. And it's real bad. I mean, you're waking up and like there really is no escape. And to me, that's like the real, that's another thing that's like, this is a purely like qualitative,
destroying your life.
That doesn't really seem to have some kind of a quantitative application in the world, but you can see how another agent of normalizing this authoritarian power grab is the insistence on that would-be dictator being in your dreams, being in every thought in your waking moment. And so like there are a lot of names that I choose to skip over, in addition to 45. And this is, I don't mean that entirely in a negative way. I skip the names of some local and area organizers. I skip the names of some people who, were fighting back in Charlottesville. And I may have missed the mark with a couple of those, with a couple of those. My general choice with 45 simply had to do with not making things worse by like, and trusting that we've all had this same terrible experience of this nightmare man invading our minds for years. And so nobody needs an extra dose of that name, that voice, that face. Like we've all been there. And in reading this book, part of my contract with the reader is that the overwhelming majority of adults in America have had extremely similar experiences, including moderate, sane, conservative Americans. Like that, it is criminally under-discussed that moderate, sane conservatives were also scared, anxious, disappointed, angry, and there wasn't, like the normalization worked extra fast on their end, I imagine, because there was absolutely no room to kind of air those doubts. So a lot of it is really just trusting that these are broadly shared experiences and to allow the reader to project as much of their own lives into it and not necessarily read it as strictly being an account of my life.
Did your relationship with the late Representative John Lewis help give you any perspective on what was actually going on in Washington, or did it make it even scarier? Or again, did you not have a lot of direct conversation about this?
Oh no, during 2016, 2017, 2018, we were adventuring across the country like every week or every other week. We spent a lot of time together during this. So every once in a while I'd get a couple of updates, but yes, both. It was very informative and also terrifying. Hearing Congressman Lewis say that in all of his years in Congress, he had never seen dysfunction, antagonism, and obstruction like he had seen in post 2014. But increasingly before the House flipped, 2017 and 2018, those were some of the terrifying markers in having a declaration that this is the worst Congressman Lewis had ever seen the dysfunction, which is saying a lot. For the most part, it was just really a lifesaver having Congressman Lewis in my life during this time period. Just his temperance, his playing the long game, his absolute lack of compromise on a moral and ethical level. A lot of this really helped me. I don't feel like I necessarily needed it in the larger worldly sense, but it was a lifesaver on the personal side of things. What allowed me to be a more temperate, understanding, patient dad and husband, and what allowed me to recognize that I needed to do what I needed to do to, keep my own anxiety and fear and rage from getting the best of me when thinking about this dismal future that we were pummeling towards, which we still are pummeling towards,
Sure. And I forget, have I ever told you, and I never got to meet him, but have I ever told you my John Lewis related story?
I don't think so.
Well, I live in northern New Jersey, so to get down to DC for, any late morning meeting, I have to get up at 4 a.m., get to Newark, get the train, get down to Union Station, go to the Hill. And I had I think a 10 or 11 a.m. with staff for Representative Vargas, Democrat, San Diego. And I get up 4 a.m. I check my phone just as I'm starting to make sure traffic to get to Newark's okay, et cetera. And there are emails and voicemails from his staff saying, Gil, we're so sorry, but Representative Lewis called a sit-in for gun rights.
Oh, wow.
And we're all down on the floor and it's already 1 o'clock in the morning. And is there any way you could come later in the day? Because we're going to be exhausted. And I wrote them back with, when Representative Lewis says you sit in, you sit in. Yes. I will come down 3 p.m. I'll be down there. I'll stop by your place at 3. Let me know if that's good, during the day once you're back up. But yeah, that was my moral thing. I'm like, I'm not going to be mad in the slightest. John Lewis called for you to sit in. You better go do that.
That's right.
That's, he has the moral claim. I'm just an inconvenienced guy in New Jersey, but yeah, I never got to meet him for my interactions on the Hill. I'm largely in the pharmaceutical space. So, he wasn't on energy and commerce, so we didn't get to interact at all. But yeah, just what a figure. Do you much in the way I was wondering about, sort of chronicling yourself through the book, do you see who you were before meeting him and working with him versus now? Do you see a difference in who you are?
I do. Yeah. However, one interesting thing about the path of my life in the last decade is that I became a dad the same week I started work on March. Yeah. And so, my older daughter has literally been surrounded by these images of protest and by work on March and by John Lewis as an overarching context for every day of her life. So a lot of the shifts which occurred once I really devoted my whole working self to March is inseparable from the change in my life from being a parent, but then also what that means, not being in bands anymore, turning almost all my social interactions towards comics and away from music and punk by necessity, by not having any time. So it was a massive personal shift, I think. I would say that once Congressman Lewis and Andrew and I started really spending a lot of time together in the summer of 2013, there was just a massive personal benefit, and a lot of 2013 and early 2014 were really peaceful, tranquil, cozy times where there was a good balance with a lot of things in life. And I kind of pinpoint July to August 2014 as the month in which the world kind of went to hell in terms of the Russian downing of the jet, the invasion of Ukraine, the murder of Michael Brown, the Islamic State declaring a caliphate, and that being the biggest challenge in my adult life I've ever had to my intense anti-militarism, but also to I think the Islamic State declaring a caliphate is the biggest challenge I've ever had to my personal understanding and application of nonviolence as an overarching.
It was going to be my closing question, but when is it okay to punch a Nazi?
It's always okay to punch a Nazi. I am not John Lewis. So I am a huge believer in nonviolence with a capital N. I am a huge believer in it as an overarching philosophy and a way of life, but it is not my way of life. And I don't think that those things are mutually exclusive. So yeah, I don't. This may be the first time I've ever said that in terms of.
I bring those things out of people.
But it's important. Yeah, we're talking about fascists here. Fascists can't be reasoned with. They can't be loved away. They can only be, you can make them go away and go back under their rocks, or you're going to have to kill them. So this is why we try to deal with them early and take their power away so that we don't have to be killed by them or kill them.
This is a fundamental difference between us, Nate. I'm first generation American, and my parents were born 1940 and 1938, Jews in Europe. And we come from a long history of purges, fascists, etc. And we have awful history, especially in the Holocaust. So for me, this has been the backdrop my entire life. There's always the sense that, but it could flip.
Yeah.
We always had it can happen here. And I admit I let it slide. In 2016, I recorded with Harold Bloom, the writer, literary professor at Yale. And he said explicitly he was rereading Sinclair Lewis because he felt Trump was, America was ready for this. And, we should not be taking it lightly. And I was like, oh, God, we're past all that now. And much like your first chapter of the book. But yeah, I've always had the sense that we were, my people in particular, as Jews, always just looking over our shoulders, no matter how assimilated we are in any country. Doesn't mean we're, able to fight back, but at least we're ready to in some respects, or at least try to run away somewhere safe. But
without a doubt. Yeah. And I think one of the, I guess, an emerging conclusion or realization I had during the process of doing Save It for Later had to do with being a person who's born at the tail end of Generation X. It's white Southerner raised by white Southerner baby boomers. The older I get, the more I feel like my generation is more strongly linked to the baby boomers than to millennials, specifically by the erroneous assumption of the inevitability of social progress, by the privilege of assuming things will naturally work themselves out, by the arc of the moral universe bending towards justice on its own. I think I tried whenever possible to really spread out the blame so that I'm specifically blaming myself and my generation, but also talking about the kind of reckonings that I've had with baby boomers and the in my personal experiences, the incredible resilience holding on to these outmoded assumptions that this can't happen here, that the American people simply won't stand for this, that they can't just force their way into an overhaul of democracy altogether. And this is where I really put hopes in my kids' generation of being immune to that kind of bullshit in the same way that my generation is immune to other kinds of BS. But we still linger on with a little bit of this assumption that, things will work themselves out in the end.
Yeah. And, having 8 years of Obama leading into this, kind of, I'll say, fed that myth. We'll put it that way, that there was a sense of, oh, yes, we're headed towards this, it can only go in one direction as
Certainly.
Opposed to a pendulum.
Or even as opposed to a pendulum swinging all the way backwards, the notion that the pendulum swing is something without direction. It's an aperiodic
thing where it's just wobbling all over the fucking place. Yeah.
But it's also, it's this soundbite, this myth that always sounded so good until Election Day 2016, where both parties are the same candidates. There's no difference. It's all the system. It's all the man. All that it's not untrue, but my God, how many times as a 90s, 2000s punk, involved in certain modes of activism, how much lip service did my generation of punks put up with in terms of there's no point in voting because it's all the same system. It's all the same thing. There's no difference in what happens. And then you see how those exact lines were used by Russian internet trolls and intelligence services to sway social media discourse leading up to the 2016 election. And I'm still deeply bitter at some punk acquaintances and ex-friends who I remember selling that stupid line about like, don't vote because it doesn't matter. It's all the same system. And I'm like, you know what? Shame on you.
Yeah. And I think of, 2000, which should have been the moment we all got that, oh, yeah, if you don't vote and you don't actually fill out the ballot right, you end up losing by 527 votes in Florida when, and again, we see the direction of the world change quite drastically.
I had in one of the strangest moments of my March life, I had breakfast at Al Gore's house one time, just kicking it at Al Gore's house. And I was like, this was very early on in the March days. So this is like me in real time kind of trying to catch up with what I would get a lot lot smoother and more diplomatic about. But at the time I was like, this is it. I'm going to apologize to Al Gore for voting for Ralph Nader. And I was like, I'm sure it'll go over great. And we're like eating muffins or whatever. And I was like, Mr. Vice President, I just want to take this time to say, I'm really sorry. In the 2000 election, I was one of those people who voted for Nader because I was like, what difference could there be? I want to vote my ideals. But the weird thing is in Arkansas, where I was registered, I think Bush only won by like 1,400 or 1,600 votes. I mean, I think I probably knew 200 Nader voters personally. And I'm like, forget Florida. Like the election was so close that these 1,600 voters in Arkansas could have swung the election.
If Gore had won his home state, then none of this would have been an issue. If Tennessee had gone for Gore, that would have been,
Boy, the apology did not go over swimmingly. Like it was fine, but then I was like, oh,
wall of ice.
This is a deep societal wound, and I was like, I should shut up. I should really listen to Andrew's advice a little bit better from now on.
I'll tell you a great one I had on the Acela a couple of years ago, maybe 2 years ago, back when we could travel places. I was headed down. The governor of New Jersey got on the train one stop after me. And a guy, I notice him there because of the detail around us. And a guy comes over and says, Governor, I just want to say, I didn't vote for you, but it's an honor to meet you. And I'm just sitting there thinking, why do you have to tell him that? Just say it's an honor to meet you. That's fine. You really don't have to say, I disagree with you, but just let it go. It's perfectly fine.
And yet at the same time, that's the kind of approach to political difference that it seems kind of meaningless, but at the same time, like that's
civility. I get it, but
that reveals something which, I feel like I would like shed a tear if a constituent came up to me and was like, "Yeah, I just want you to know, like, it is an honor to meet you. I don't agree with you, but I fundamentally respect you." Like this shows like the kinds of shifts that can happen from decade to decade.
Well, I did see Murphy again, the governor, on my very final train ride, which is end of February last year. And he was going in for cancer surgery in a couple of days. And I just went over and wished him good luck, good health, et cetera. I said, I gave him my card. I said, I'm a lobbyist. I'm literally not going to say anything to you about what I do. I'm not going to lobby you about anything. But he came over during the train ride to thank me later on. And I was like, didn't have to do that. Nice of him. It's cool. Yeah. At the time, we were all worried about, the end of the world, which ended up happening. But he made it through this stuff just fine. And actually, this reminds me, this weekend, we started getting hit with the excerpts from John Boehner's memoir, where the former Ohio representative and Speaker of the House, who apparently is just lambasting the 2010 wave of his own party, and just basically said any moron with the letter R next to his name on the ballot was going to win. And a lot of them did. And, just said it became ungovernable and it was filled with a bunch of know-nothing angry yahoos who hated Obama for reasons that we know are pretty obvious.
Yes.
Yeah. So the other question about March, away from the political side of it, what did it teach you about making comics and storytelling? And as a flip side of that, what did you have to sort of unlearn for non-March projects?
Well, if I had a special effects board here, I would set off some bells and whistles, because thank you for asking the rare comics storytelling related question about March. Thank you.
Hey, I'm the best.
In March, I feel like this is something that's very obvious to me, but I don't know how noticeable it would be to people who are not me, who might look at my comics. The process of doing March, aside from basically getting to take myself back to school to relearn civil rights history, it forced me into a position in which not only was I finally, getting okay at certain levels of reference and research and fact checking and working back and forth with editors, but also establishing a comfort level for my own execution of pages and narrative sequences. But the sheer level of concreteness required on the page to communicate a lot of information while trying to minimize the sheer amount of text, and being forced into a position where I was just having to be comfortable putting a lot of text on 6-panel pages over and over and over again. It allowed me to take that back to my weirdo magical realist fiction work and kind of make the stories themselves weirder, but have them finally make more sense, simply because of the concreteness and the clarity. Also, I think Come Again was the book that I penciled and wrote while I was doing the March trilogy, and then I inked and colored and finished it immediately afterwards. And Lee Walton, the great, kind, generous Lee Walton, was my editor on both of those books. And so I know that editing March was a revolutionary experience for Lee as well, but he was able to bring a lot of those editorial changes back into my weirdo fiction for Come Again. And I think I was able to execute a much stranger, more disjointed set of realities in that book, thanks to doing the March trilogy and being a lot more at home, simply laying out things in a clear way when necessary, and not feeling the still immature insecurity where you have to kind of bury the thing you want to say in a bunch of weird stuff or, bells and whistles. Yeah. It has allowed me to be much more comfortable with being plain and concrete whenever necessary.
I was going to say, because, I read it this morning. I hadn't read it previously. I sat down with it this morning on my gigantic iPad, which, Comixology, blah, blah, blah. But I thought about that in relation to Swallow Me Whole, which I will admit I had trouble with for the reasons that you're now articulating, which tell me that, it wasn't just me. Okay, this is how things evolved. This book, Come Again, does have a much more, even when it's fantastic, it's grounded. And it's spatially, things worked in ways that, I didn't get from some of your pre-March work. So cool.
I agree. And it's interesting in that Swallow Me Whole touched and moved people, a few cross sections of people in this really visceral, enduring way. And it was very important for me to make that story between 2004 and 2007. But as each year has gone by, the more obvious it is to me that, I'm still in love with the characters in that book. And I've written a screenplay and a TV pilot out of the book, and each of those, it's a lot of fun to return to it and add and change things. And I still really love the story, but it's more obvious to me that I just really lucked out with Swallow Me Whole, that it spoke in a particular way at a particular time that people resonated with, and it was just barely hanging on to the strands of logic. I think of all my books, it was dreaminess pushed to its extreme, and it required really just submitting to the weirdness of the story. And so I think I've been backing away, like as I get more skills, more storytelling skills with concreteness and clarity, it allows me to back away from using dreaminess as a crutch. So like with Come Again and with the new undisclosed book I'm doing right now, I'm able to get much weirder with the interdimensional dream world stuff in those books, simply because I'm not afraid of going from point A to point Z in the plot.
I get you. Yeah, that's sort of what I was wondering, whether the experience of doing that, exactly how it shaped you, in the non-political, non-John Lewis work. Do you think about that in terms of balancing your essentially non-political fiction and I guess you're afraid of being pigeonholed, or is there a need to balance the non-political fiction and the politically infused, both the John Lewis work and now the essays and memoir?
I mean, this sounds like a cliche, but I reject the assumption, the understandable assumption, that like Swallow Me Whole, Any Empire, that my weirdo fiction is apolitical.
I know. Like, I said essentially non-political is how I wrote it. I'm like, because it's not explicitly political. Yeah,
I agree with what you're saying, but yes, like one of the things I've had to establish more when since March Book 1 came out, is that I'm guided so much by social and political interests and concerns that, as dating back to comics I was doing 20 years ago, or even like the dystopian guns and boobs superhero comics I started making in the early 90s. I mean, you take out the Rob Liefeld guns and the boobs, and it's still like a team of ragtag misfits working in an underground effort to overthrow an authoritarian regime bent on controlling the world. So I feel like each one of my works is pretty focused on a fight for dignity, equality, and justice. But it depends. When you're 14 and you live in Arkansas pre-internet, then it's going to come out in a guns and boobs kind of way.
Yeah, understandable. Can you tell me a bit about like where comics began for you, but also something I want to make sure we get to, questioning some of the comics, like the Liefeld stuff, like the Punisher, when it comes to something like About Face. And we all know that the Punisher was badass in the 80s, but,
sure.
Where did comics start for you? When did you start questioning what you were, you were enjoying versus what you made?
For me, I was born in 78. And my inroad into comics was in 1981, when the Hulk, Wonder Woman, and Spider-Man were all on TV at the same time.
Yeah, you had the Wonder Woman mentioned in the book, and I wanted to make sure that got in because Linda Carter.
Wonder Woman's probably the most central superhero in my life, even though I never regularly read her books after the age of 5.
Yeah.
However, so I went from the Hulk, Wonder Woman, Spider-Man trifecta into Larry Hama's G.I. Joe and Transformers right alongside in the mid-'80s. I was lucky enough, because of this weird bookstore where I got my comics in Alabama in the mid-'80s, I was lucky enough to get in on the very last sliver of multimedia circus Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. So I stumbled across these weird, gritty 1986, early 87 Turtles issues that helped expand my notion of what comics were. But the biggest expander was the Nom, which Marvel published, starting in 86. I was recommended it because of being a G.I. Joe kid in a military family in the 80s. But the fact that it was a series written about the closer real subjective experience of being a drafted teenager in the Vietnam War, with each issue covering a month of a soldier's tour of duty. This comic, pretty much by itself, was the thing which allowed me to start having real discussions with my dad about military service and about empire and violence, and about the nature of war, the nature of conformity. So a lot of those questions and answers and lingering discussions, like some of that stuff, a lot of it went into Any Empire. And then a lot of what still hadn't been unpacked wound up in About Face, 32 years later. In terms of the legacy of, post Frank Miller, 80s, 90s, Guns and Pouches comics, like I read those things. I laughed at them, but I love them also. I've drawn plenty of pouches on my characters in the past. And frankly, like I go into the Punisher's Death's Head skull and move a little bit into its history and its context with other Death's Heads. But this is the kind of thing where I really don't place blame on the Punisher or any creative storytellers involved with the Punisher's history. And actually, I don't necessarily care enough to either. I've had some friends, like write and draw the Punisher in the past. And it's not like, that's not the point. The point with the kind of normalizing of a lot of these fascist and authoritarian symbols, the two most recognizable among them being the Blue Lives Matter flag and the Punisher skull, sometimes combined. The entire point was that the biggest danger I wanted to highlight was less their use by explicit, organized white supremacists and militia units, but the normalization of the presence of those symbols by their kind of perceived apolitical use, just as pop culture symbols, as cool stuff to buy. And I think that played very well into the notion of providing some cover for white supremacists and fascists. It provides a plausible deniability. The more widely used these symbols are, the less they are thought about, and the greater the passive defenses are to the fact that you can see them being used explicitly in service of white supremacy. And, these paramilitary units, and the threat is extremely real. And so there is a great benefit by fascists in having these symbols be wildly popular without any of the baggage of what they claim, what they state.
Literally being a swastika. Yeah.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, I did a show with Stephen Heller, again, it was in the before time, where we talked about his book on, white supremacist imagery, focusing on the swastika, but also, as a guidebook of 10 million other types of images and how they have these careful tweaks so they can, again, give plausible deniability that, no, this is just our Norse heritage,
right. Oh,
that sort of thing. But, yeah. As a point of reference, my first mainstream thing like your Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles was unfortunately Megaton Man by Don Simpson.
Oh, yeah, man. That's Rob Liefeld's first published work, was in Megaton Man #5.
No shit. Yeah. I think I've still got them somewhere downstairs in the basement. I'll have to go dig them up just for the novelty factor. But that was the first instance where this isn't Marvel or DC. Sure. Can I do this? And little kid, etc. But
as a pure side quest here for about 20 seconds, whenever I go back to my hometown and go to my original local comic shop there, I get so much, this is in the before times, of course, such a delight to go into the quarter bins and discover that like 35 years later, there's like a disproportionate amount of the quarter bins that's made from those 80s third and fourth string indies that existed, just below the kitchen sink press level. Yeah. But, of the Comico, Pacifico, first Eclipse variety. And there's some real amazing kind of gems that, they probably didn't thrive in the mid 80s, but it's incredible to see the relative breadth of independent stabs at adventure stories of like power-based adventure stories that are just, easily findable in quarter bins across the country. So like that became my real joy the last few years, was once a year spending like $20 in the quarter bins and coming back with all these 80s indies.
I'll say I've been posting bookshelf pictures on Instagram and Twitter lately, and somebody noticed the hardcover compilation of the Puma Blues, which which has a new conclusion, which I still haven't gotten around to reading, which is the comments that went back and forth about this, because unfortunately it has a long introduction by Dave Sim.
Oh, yes.
That just goes, as you would expect, totally off the fucking rails. And so it's I've been explaining to this guy, I'm like, yeah, I couldn't really get past that and get back to the 18, 19-year-old I was reading Murphy and Zully in Puma Blues back then. Oh, I should really read that intro. I'm like, no, the exact thing I'm telling you is the opposite.
Right. Not necessary. Yeah, some things don't age well.
Yeah. But yeah, I'm thinking of all those days with Grendel and Scout and Grimjack and all those things we were reading back in the 80s when we were kind of getting away from the mainstream. But do you remember a break that you really made? I know you mentioned the Turtles, but like for me, it was the guy who introduced me to Love and Rockets my freshman year of college. That was, do you have a moment like that?
Yeah, in my comics path, before the big break, being that my notion of comics kind of the doors really blew open. The first major shift, obviously, was being introduced to the X-Men, family, and that arriving at the end of 6th grade for me, and not only like finally getting to read superhero soap opera, but the fact that thrash metal arriving in my life simultaneously with the X-Men gave me a social conscience, period. And so this would be, 1990, this would be a really crucial window in which I'm for the first time examining with my own mind the sexism, racism, homophobia, nationalism in my world around me. It was not until I graduated from high school and moved away from Arkansas for college in like 1996 that I really became truly aware that there were comics that weren't superhero comics, which sounds absolutely bonkers. But it took my town had one comic book store, and I did not, my family didn't have internet access at all in the 90s or anything. And so I'd say that a lot of it was through Migraine, like is an underground DIY punk and punk adjacent publisher out of Portland, or no, maybe out of San Francisco. Ian Lynham was the publisher of Migraine in the mid 90s. And so a lot of those books were really important to me. Specifically a student, like a friend and classmate of mine who forced me to read Chester Brown's I Never Liked You, I think in 1997. And I remember him being like, you need to read this, go take it, read it now. And I was like, oh, cool, thanks, I appreciate it. And I remember him being like, no, you need to go home and read this now. And I went back to like my dorm room, and I think I went to go sit on the pot or whatever. And I was like, I guess I'll start reading this now. And then 2 hours later, I finished the book, and I had cried 9 times. And that I think I Never Liked You was the book that completely revolutionized my page layouts, my use of negative space, use of quiet moments. I was already into a lot of 80s manga that had trickled into Arkansas by the early 90s, mostly, Appleseed, Akira, the big dogs. So there were some of those panel transitions and stuff with the slowing down and speeding up of time and focusing on different components. I got a lot out of those already, but Chester Brown allowed me to really see that I can make a comic out of anything that I feel like needs to be expressed. And there's a moment at the beginning of that book where our protagonist goes to get his mom quietly, and she's upstairs, and he takes her hand and brings her down all the way to the kitchen to the refrigerator, and there's a broken egg on the floor. And mom is like, oh, is this what you wanted to show me? Oh, you thought I'd be mad. And she just gives him a hug. And that was it. And there's nothing else. And it's completely silent. And that destroyed me as a 19 or 20-year-old. I had never seen that kind of devastating silence about such a small thing before. This is the kind of stuff that it's like, I sense my own mental resistance to being moved by that. And you have to kind of just simply place yourself in a pre-American Beauty world where you will allow yourself to be moved by moments like that without scoffing at the plastic bag blowing in the wind for 15 minutes.
Always that shitty image that we're stuck with.
Oh, yeah. But again, I mean, I was 21 when I saw that. I cried in the theater when I saw that plastic bag. It took me a couple of years to be embarrassed by that. Yeah. But yeah, like some of that's, it's like sad boy popcorn, and it does its thing. And then hopefully you're able to grow from that instead of that being like the peak of emotional expression.
Trust me, many years ago, a pal from my freshman year in college, I met up with him during a business trip, and he's like, man, I still have this pile of books that you told me I need to read back when we were at college, that freshman year. And I haven't gotten to everything yet, but I'm going to tackle them. And I said to him, Paul, do not tell me what they are. Throw them out. I will send you something. I don't want to know what I thought other people should read at 18, because it's going to embarrass both of us, but mainly me. I really don't need to realize, wow, I was that bad. I have been keeping a list of every book, non-comics, like every prose book I finished since 1989 when I started school. And it's horrifying, some of the early stuff. And I'm afraid some of those things were on Paul's nightstand all these years. But
that's all right.
Yeah.
He's going to have his own. Paul's going to have his own contract, his own relationship with those books. So once the book finds itself in somebody's hands, that's up to the reader and the book.
Right. That's the journey they all have to take. Last question, which I think I know the answer to. What would the 8th chapter of Save It for Later consist of?
Well, I would when I was doing the final chapter, the 7th chapter, which is chapter number 6 in the book itself. I drew it between May and August of 2020. I did not. Going into it, I was really afraid that by doing an afterword or an epilogue, like my publisher and I, we had obviously discussed what was going to happen on Election Day, and we knew we had about 3 weeks after Election Day to wrap everything up before the book had to be at the printer. And so we tossed around ideas about, like, I was even going to rough out 2 different epilogues. I tossed that idea around for a bit. But my immediate response to that idea that would have popped up in my head right afterwards was that I should be doing this book so that its core messages are not crippled by the result of, by the electoral result this year. Obviously, the world and our nation will be changed irrevocably one way or another, but the fundamental problems which brought us to the brink of fascism not only are not going away, but we are still living the last 5 years. We're like, the 2020s are still going to be the last 5 years as we prevent it from happening again and again. We try to fix systemic problems to prevent it from happening. We try to get, better and better about not assuming that things are going to work themselves out without working, across a huge gulf of ideological difference to work together just to have democracy survive. So I'm very happy with the way that the book ended up, because I feel like it survived my test of turning out the same regardless of electoral result. I would say that if I did an 8th chapter, it would have to do with the world reawakening and being as cautious and with as low of expectations of a Biden administration as many people I know, but also being cautiously, pleasantly surprised by our by the ability of a functioning government to do its job. But I'd say a lot of the eighth chapter would have to do with like learning to kind of reprogram and deprogram so many of the assumptions and fight or flight instincts, to kind of reground ourselves and not constantly be in a mode of always reacting to something, getting out of a reactive state and proactively working towards and against things. That's going to be another real test. I think like one of their major victories during the previous administration was having the overwhelming majority of the American people constantly just being reacting to something that was happening or was under threat of happening. And we rose to the challenge, but it still is removing agency from the people. And so I think reclaiming some of that proactive, less reactive stance is important. And also like reestablishing baselines of trust with our neighbors, and kind of trying to back away from the precipice in terms of, I don't know, I think a lot of the absolutes that I've taught myself really hold up in terms of people really showing who they are and recognizing what a huge proportion of white Americans are perfectly fine with fascism in the ways that it doesn't necessarily directly impact their day-to-day lives, or they don't think it does until it comes for them too. And I think that is true, but it requires also, like recognizing a level of functionality with the muggles in all of our lives, the people who are around us who are just kind of going to work and eating their dinner and mowing their grass and going through their lives. Again, like recognizing that, as I tell my kids every day, like we can't control the people around us. We can control ourselves and the way that we react and respond. So I think that would be the eighth chapter, is coming back out of the shell of the past 5 years.
And, I want to ask about the future book in relation to that. So, Nate, thanks so much for coming on. I'm glad we finally got to talk. I'm bummed out we didn't get to do this at a festival or a con or something. But
I agree.
Maybe next year.
There will be those in the future, though. So let's make it happen.
Will do. Thanks so much, man.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
And that was Nate Powell. You should check out his new book, Save It for Later, Promises, Parenthood, and the Urgency of Protest, from Abrams Comic Arts. It's out today, which is April 6th, 2021, for you time travelers out there. Save It for Later is a really thoughtful exploration into the effects of the last 4 or 5 years on our psyches, as well as all the years that led up to where we are. And like I said, maybe gives us room for hope. Also, like I said, it forms an elegant companion to Nate's work on March, the biography of Congressman John Lewis, which every damn body should read. You should also check out Nate's fiction, or we'll just say his fiction, like Come Again, Any Empire, and Swallow Me Whole. And you can follow Nate at his website, seemybrotherdance.org, which is spelled exactly like it sounds, all one word. C is S-E-E. He's also on Twitter as Nate_Powell_art, and on Instagram as seemybrotherdance. There'll be links to all that in the show and episode notes, so don't worry if you didn't catch it. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories show by telling people about it. Just let people know about the show. Tell them, hey, great conversation with writers, artists, cartoonists, painters, musicians, translators, publishers, and other interesting people. Also, you can write me. Tell me what you like and don't like about the show, who you'd like to hear me record with, or what movie, TV show, book, music, comic, whatever you think I should turn listeners onto. And you can do that by email, which people do, or by Twitter or Instagram message. But I like getting letters and postcards. You can find my address relatively easily. Or you can leave me a message on my Google Voice number, which is 973-869-9659. I don't I don't answer that number. I just get voicemails there. You have a 3-minute limit, and if you want, I can include your message on an upcoming episode of the show if it's any good. I actually got a neat one a couple of days ago from a listener who had a question or a feeling about how one of my conversations went, and she thought I came off in a certain way and wanted to let me know she felt that, and that led to a nice direct message exchange where, you know, I clarified some of what I was thinking, but also understood where she was coming from. And basically, I don't want to name names or anything. So it was a really nice exchange, and it was a nice use of the Google Voice function to be able to have somebody leave that sort of message without them having to put it all in writing or, well, anyway, call 973-869-9659. Now, if you want to follow Nate's example and help try to fix the world, there are a lot of ways you can do that. If you've got resources and just a little bit of money, you could support individuals in need through GoFundMe, Patreon, Kickstarter, Indiegogo. There are all sorts of ways to help people who are in need. You can also just give somebody money directly. There are all those apps you can do that with, as well as, you know, in-person exchanges. But you can also help institutions in need, like the Poor People's Campaign, your local food bank, freedom funds. There are a lot of different things you can do to help build a better world. So I hope you'll help. And I still have, as of this weekend, I now have 30 copies left of the first issue of my first zine, Haiku for Business Travelers. I'm getting back to writing a little. I'm getting back into the mode where I can write. I'm not necessarily writing yet. I'm doing a lot of time drawing those trees, to be honest, but I want to get back to writing and do the second issue. Anyway, if you want the first issue, just drop me a line. It's free. Email me with your name and mailing address, and I'll send you a copy. If you want to kick in a few bucks for postage and production, you can, but honestly, my day job takes care of those expenses just fine. And, you know, there's a nice aspect, I guess, to getting a little money in exchange for art, but not in the whole NFT kind of scammy way. Anyway, this is just me sharing my art, such as it is. If you want to check it out, I hope you'll drop me a line. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.